This program is a Warren Steibel production in association with South Carolina ETV. Funding for Firing Line is made possible by a major grant from the John M. Olin Foundation, Incorporated, and the Friends of Firing Line.
The author of the book Dereliction of Duty is a mean man. H.R. McMaster's theses, or rather his indictments, are against President Lyndon Johnson and Robert McNamara and many of the chiefs of staff. What his book maintains is that all the assumptions about the Vietnam War that we tend to cling to, both those who approved the war and those who did not, are severely misguided because they do not know the facts that he discloses in this book. Major McMaster graduated from the U.S. Military Academy at West Point in 1984 and went on to get advanced degrees and a doctorate in history from the University of North Carolina at Chapel Hill. He went on to teach history at West Point, and in the Gulf War he commanded a cavalry regiment in combat. He currently serves with the 11th Armed Cavalry Regiment in Fort Irwin, California. The subtitle of Major McMaster's book is Lyndon Johnson, Robert McNamara, the Joint Chiefs of Staff, and the Lies That Led to Vietnam. That's very tough language, and the most obvious question to lead off with is, why did every important person in Washington, seemingly, from 1964 to the end, engage in lying? My first question then is to ask Major McMaster, what was the purpose of lies in that situation by those people that draws special attention to them?
Yes. Well, one of the elements of the conventional wisdom in connection with Vietnam is that Vietnam was a quagmire that sucked an unwitting American government into a war that it fundamentally did not understand. What this new evidence suggests, much of it recently declassified documents of the most confidential meetings between the president and his closest advisors, and tapes of telephone conversations, for example, between Lyndon Johnson and his closest advisors and confidants, suggests that these were men who not only should have known better, but who did know better and who made these decisions anyway. So the question is, precisely as you suggest, why did they take this course in the war? And what President Johnson was seeking to do in this critical period, 1964 and 1965, the period during which Vietnam became an American war before Americans even recognized that fact, is that he was seeking to avoid a difficult choice he knows he must make between war and disengagement in Vietnam. What he fears is that making that difficult choice will alienate key constituencies on which his domestic political agenda depends, namely getting elected in his own right in 1964 and passing the bulk of the Great Society legislation in 1965. So what Johnson does is he seeks a middle ground, a middle policy, a policy that he can use to placate people on both sides of the issue, and a policy that is built fundamentally on piles of lies and obfuscations aimed at the American public, the Congress, and members of the administration.
I mean, Wilson campaigned for presidency on the grounds that under no circumstances would he bring us into the war. So did FDR. What is it especially about Lyndon Johnson, especially when both sides, the Republicans and the Democrats, were almost unanimous in thinking that the doctrine of containment should be enforced?
Right. Well, what's different about it is that this new evidence that is now available suggests that the war was not inevitable in Vietnam. Typically what you hear about Vietnam, and certainly what is contained in the historiography of that war, is the interpretation that the war in Vietnam was inevitable and that it was brought on by a tidal wave of Cold War ideology. What this new evidence reveals in dramatic fashion is not only was the war not inevitable, but indeed that it was only made possible through these lies and deceptions. What is also significant about this evidence is that...
What do you mean it was only... We know that there was a Geneva Agreement. We know that neither the North nor the South followed the terms of the agreement. We know that an armed attempt to terrorize the countryside by the Viet Cong happened. Now, why is a lie built into an accounting of that story?
Well, fully half of the story of how and why Vietnam has become an American war has been absent. And that is the role of the senior military in these decisions that led to war. What's clear from this new evidence is that the Joint Chiefs of Staff believe that it will take at least 500,000 troops and 5 years just to stabilize the situation in South Vietnam. Lyndon Johnson and Robert McNamara, on the other hand, intend to severely limit the level of American military commitment for the reasons I mentioned, really his desire to protect his domestic political agenda. If they had been able to reconcile their views and to confront their differences, they could not have helped but come to a conclusion that an American war in Vietnam was a futile endeavor because the American public would not support that level of effort. Indeed, what happens in 1964 and 1965 is Lyndon Johnson is pursuing consensus in Vietnam, which is the absence of leadership. He is, in essence, abdicating leadership in Vietnam and attempting to circumvent the Constitution of the United States to deny the American public and the Congress a say in matters that involve life and death. Now, not only was this undemocratic, but it removed an important corrective to what was an unwise policy. As American involvement in the war deepens, the gap between the true nature of American involvement in the war and Lyndon Johnson's portrayal of it to the American public widens.
Now, slow down a bit, Major.
Yes.
We talk, okay, 1964, you're telling me that the Joint Chiefs estimated we needed 500,000 men to correct the situation.
Yes.
And you think that he was obliged to pass along that estimate to the American people?
Well, he was obliged by law to give his best, the Joint Chiefs were, to give their best military advice to the President, the Secretary of Defense, and the National Security Council. They failed to do that because what the Joint Chiefs of Staff do in this period is they compromise principle for expediency themselves. And what they resolve to do, recognizing the momentum that has built up behind Lyndon Johnson's policy for Vietnam and Robert S. McNamara's strategy for the war that is based primarily not on the political and military situation in South Vietnam or in Asia or having primarily to do with America's global imperative of containing communism, but what it is based on is what is good for the president in the short term. This is the so-called strategy of graduated pressure. The chiefs stop questioning that strategy, even though that they know it could only lead to disaster in Vietnam, and instead they take a foot-in-the-door approach in Vietnam. Just try to get the first bombing runs off. Just try to get the first Marine units deployed. And then what they hope to do is, over time, erode the barriers to more resolute military action so that the war can be conducted in a way that's more in keeping with their own ideas of the use, in connection with the use of military force.
Well, there's been a lot written about that period. And I was there a few times and talked to General Westmoreland, General Abrams, and I want you to tell me, beyond what you said in your book, why I should have thought this general, treating me very nicely, likes National Review, likes the conservative movement, why is he lying to me? Now, there were progressive reversals. Now, we ended up with 500,000 men.
That's correct.
The number you said was thought to be requisite by the Joint Chiefs.
That's right.
And we still lost.
Well, what's significant about the fact that you point out is that ultimately that level of commitment is made, but that the American people were not permitted to participate in the decision from the outset, even though the Joint Chiefs of Staff know, for example, that that is going to be the level of force that is necessary. Why you should have thought that perhaps General Westmoreland was not perhaps wise in his prosecution of the war is that there was an absolute absence of a strategy in Vietnam, particularly in the period in which we go to war.
But that has nothing to do with lying, does it?
Well, what happens in this period, a number of cables are passed back and forth between the chairman of the Joint Chiefs of Staff and General Westmoreland in Vietnam. And General Westmoreland is asking some pretty tough questions in 1965, early 1965, about limitations on the air campaign, the difficulties that causing, and how a much more robust effort is needed in connection with the war. And General Wheeler, the chairman of the Joint Chiefs of Staff, is responding to these cables by saying, well, that's all very well, General Westmoreland, we know that that is the situation, but what I'd like you to do is just hang on in the short term. The key is to, and this is a direct quotation from one of those cables, to break the psychological and political logjam associated with taking the initial military actions, direct military actions against North Vietnam and in South Vietnam. And so this is, again, This is again evidence in connection with this foot in the door approach rather than questioning fundamentally the nature of the strategy associated with the war. McNamara's plan for the war, the plan of graduated pressure. What is also interesting in this period is the absolute absence of strategy, as I alluded to earlier. One would think that if one were confronting a situation like that in Vietnam, that the president would want to develop a clearly defined policy goal and objective, present that to the Joint Chiefs of Staff, and then they would develop a military strategy to contribute to that policy goal and objective. And then after having done that, determine
say yes or no.
And right, exactly.
Yes.
To say yes or no, and determine the level of force necessary to carry it out, balance that against American interests, and decide whether it's worth the effort. In fact, what happened in Vietnam is the president decided what level of force was politically palatable in the short term, made that available to the Joint Chiefs of Staff, and told them to do the best they can with what they've got. In fact, instructing them directly to kill more Viet Cong. In one meeting, he tells them that it's halftime.
They're doing nothing, yeah.
Right.
Now, in your book, do you record an explicit lie at this level?
Yes.
I.e., a situation in which the president says, okay, you can have 2 divisions,
right.
Even though the Joint Chiefs have said we can't do anything with 2 divisions, we need 4. Do you have a situation that concrete?
Yes. Oh, yes. Several situations of that concrete. One anecdote is particularly compelling, but also illuminating in connection with many of these themes, having to do with the relationship and how and why Vietnam becomes an American war, the relationship between top civilian and military officials. This meeting occurs, actually a composite of 2 meetings between April 8th and April 15th, I believe, 1965. And this is just following the much publicized Johns Hopkins speech, during which Lyndon Johnson holds out sort of a Tennessee Valley Authority development program, the Mekong River Delta Project, for Southeast Asia. Interestingly, in some of these recently declassified materials, an effort which he said was aimed at, quote, placating the Sob Sisters and Peace Societies. So here we have quite a concrete example of Johnson pursuing this middle course. Having placated the Sob Sisters and Peace Societies, he moves the very next day to keep the Joint Chiefs of Staff on his team and says to them, I'm like a coach I used to know and you're my team. Johnson, not really interested in their military advice, was interested primarily in gaining their tacit approval for decisions already made, and also to gain the legitimacy lent his policies by the Joint Chiefs uniforms. So he tells the chiefs, I want to do all I can to win in Vietnam. And he tells them, you all went to the military academies, and I want you to tell me what we need to do to win. Then he goes on to tell them, well, I can't really entertain any questions or proposals you have in connection with the air campaign against North Vietnam, because that is the issue that had incited most of the early opposition to the war. But he goes on to say, I want you to tell me what we need to do to win in South Vietnam. And he turns to the chairman of the Joint Chiefs of Staff, General Earl Wheeler, and asks him that question. Now, the chiefs had whittled down their estimate from 500,000 to 3 divisions because they thought that that's what they could get away with Johnson. They make that proposal. Robert McNamara, who is sitting to Lyndon Johnson's right, tallies up the number of troops that would involve and comes with a number of 150,000. At which time President Johnson says, now damn it, I can't give you 150,000. He says mothers will come out of their kitchens and take their aprons off. Again, indicative of his acknowledgement that the American public would not support even that small effort relative to what level of effort we would ultimately support in Vietnam or be compelled to support in Vietnam. He goes on to say, to ask the Chief of Staff of the Army, General Harold K. Johnson, General Johnson, what do you think? He again says 3 divisions because the chiefs again had agreed before this meeting to stick to a 3-division request. Johnson said, now I told you can't have 3 divisions. Let me tell you a story. He said, imagine you're all businessmen down in Johnson City, Texas, and you need a loan to keep your business afloat. And you go into the bank, and it's Mr. McNamara's bank. And you say to Mr. McNamara, I need a loan of $150,000. Well, Mr. McNamara tells you, you can't have $150,000, but you can have $5,000. He then looks the chiefs in the eye and says, what do? Let your business go under, or take the $5,000 and do the best you can with what you've got? And so this is what you have in Vietnam. This is what you have in terms of determining the level of forces politically palatable in the short term, making that available to the chiefs, and why in the war there's an automatic equating of activity with progress. It is ultimately explains this absence of a strategy, which explains why so many who fought there had a difficulty understanding how the risks that they were taking and the sacrifices they were making were contributing to an end of the war. And it's ultimately why the American public loses faith in the effort.
Well, I think in what you said, which is very interesting, there are three strands. Strand number one is, what does the leader, the Democratic leader, say to the people when he has in mind sacrifices which he doesn't feel he can ask them for immediately? He has to lead up to them. That's a political problem. Number two, you have a problem of how do you handle a military who say that they want 20 divisions when you feel that you can only afford politically to send them 2 or 3. Now, and a third is to what extent do you feel that the objective situation is one that might change in the right direction? Now, in all those situations, things went wrong in Vietnam, but what astonishes me about your book is your insistence that they were duplicitous. I had 3 trips in Vietnam, and I remember one time talking to Barry Goldwater when he'd just come back from there, and Barry Goldwater knew a lot about the military, and this was 1966, and he said it was tough out there. He said, we got to close the Ho Chi Minh Trail. We got to do that. But if we do that, there's hope. One version or another of that kind of thing was being said by journalists, generals, strategists. But you want to make the whole thing kind of a moral indictment. Well, but I'm just wondering whether you're talking about societies as they are.
No, I'm not. In fact, it is in a very true sense a moral indictment. I mean, what is important about these lies is not just that there were dishonesties, but what is important is the consequences that resulted from these lies. For example, in March of 1964, when President Johnson is looking for a strategy that will reconcile his effort to make sure, his priorities to make sure that Vietnam does not become a campaign issue, with his desire to get elected, to just do enough in Vietnam to keep it on the back burner politically, he sends Robert McNamara to Vietnam to devise such a strategy, which he comes back with, which he presents to the Joint Chiefs of Staff, and the Joint Chiefs of Staff say that there's no way that this could work. This could only lead to a prolonged commitment in a war in which there would be little hope for success. He says that to the Secretary of Defense and the Chairman of the Joint Chiefs of Staff, who then attend a National Security Council meeting with the President, in which they say the Chiefs are behind this 100%. And they completely misrepresent
did the Joint
their
Chiefs
views.
know that he had misrepresented them?
No, they did not know at the time. By June of 1964, they realized that the Chairman of the Joint Chiefs of Staff, General Maxwell Taylor, who was thoroughly disingenuous with his colleagues on the Joint Chiefs of Staff, as well as with members of Congress and members of the administration, they realized that their views have been not presented forthrightly to the President. They realized that they have been relegated to a position of little influence in the policymaking process. And it is at that time when they begin to demand that their views be represented, but it is also at that time that General Taylor becomes ambassador to South Vietnam, and the dynamic within the organization of the Joint Chiefs changes fundamentally. That's just one example. In June of 1964, there are others. The Gulf of Tonkin incident is a tremendous example of duplicity and connection, not only with...
Do you think that was phony?
Oh, no, it was not phony in the sense of the true meaning of the word phony.
It wasn't made up.
It was not made up. I'm convinced that the second incident did not occur. I think what the President resolved to do, and I know what the President resolved to do from the evidence that is now available, is that he resolved to take advantage of uncertain circumstances to strike a blow at criticism that came principally from Barry Goldwater and the Republican Party, that he was irresolute in the foreign policy arena. And so he had resolved quite early, before it was even clear that any incident might occur, that he would take what would appear to be resolute action after a second attack. What is duplicitous and fundamentally dishonest about the Gulf of Tonkin incident is not only the verity of the second attack, whether or not it occurred, whether or not there were doubts surrounding it, which certainly they knew at the time, they being Robert McNamara, Chairman of the Joint Chiefs of Staff, Earl Wheeler, Secretary of State Dean Rusk, as they were testifying before Congress, but also the role that American covert raids against North Vietnam under Operation Plan 34A, maritime raids against the coast had played in provoking the first attack in the Gulf of Tonkin, and so what these lives are important again because of the consequences.
Well, would this be a fair summary? We have a situation in midsummer of 1964. Goldwater is yapping as a Republican presidential candidate that the administration isn't pursuing its anti-communist obligations forcefully enough in that part of the world. And so there's an attack on one of our destroyers, and it is interpreted as an act of aggression by the North Vietnamese. But when time comes actually to trace who did it and where they came from, they're never able to do that. They can't find any oil, they can't find anything.
Right, no evidence that these ships had even been in the area.
Right, so it crept into history that it was a phony, but has it crept into history that McNamara knew it was a phony?
Oh yes, he didn't know it was a phony at the time, but what he knew at the time was that there were serious doubts as to whether or not an attack had occurred. Hours after the report of the attack, and as aircraft carriers are mobilizing to conduct the first direct American strikes against North Vietnam, overt strikes against North Vietnam, a cable comes in from the captain of the ship who says that freak sonar conditions may have occurred and strange effects from the weather. It's very doubtful that an attack did in fact occur, and I think we should hold off on any reprisals until we can confirm this. Well, then it's the way McNamara then couches his inquiries is to ask, is there any way that an attack could not have occurred? And there's just tremendous momentum by this time that has built up behind a reprisal strike. President Johnson had immediately gone, upon the first report, into a breakfast meeting with key legislators from his party and had said to them, would you support not only an attack, but a resolution, which he had already drafted a couple of months ago, that he thought would be important for staving off criticism in connection with his policy, a resolution that would give him essentially carte blanche for escalating the war. So again, these are lies, and are interesting in that they're lies, not just because they're untruths, but because they have very real consequences that seem to lead inexorably in retrospect to an American war in Vietnam. But if we had substituted even a modicum of honesty in this period at several of these turning points, an American war in Vietnam was not only not inevitable, but it would have been impossible.
Now, are you saying that in 1965, if Lyndon Johnson as president and Barry Goldwater as a competitor had said the entire integrity of the anti-communist defense is going to require us to use weapons in South Vietnam and to send perhaps as many as 500,000 troops there, you automatically rule out the possibility that might have been endorsed?
Well, no, I think that it's difficult to say in a counterfactual sense whether or not what would have occurred at that point if the president had indeed exercised leadership, been forthright with the American public.
Yeah.
But the debate, having occurred, would have set the president up either for a negotiated withdrawal or a war in Vietnam, in which the American public do not feel betrayed in 1968, for example, as they look at their television sets and shake their heads and wonder how and why this had happened,
but they
and
didn't
realize
feel
that they had
betrayed
been
in
lied
68. They
to
didn't
for
feel
so
betrayed,
long.
did they?
Well, certain segments of the population, and this is very
the Democratic
complex.
Party split, but the Humphrey wing prevailed over the McCarthy wing, the McGovern wing, and revalidated their. Now, in your book, you talk about Humphrey thinking maybe of pulling out, of publicly resigning time after time.
Well, or actually what he was in this period, and really what the book covers is the period in which Vietnam became an American war, and how and why those decisions were made.
Yeah.
And I think it explains what went wrong there as well, but the dynamic fundamentally changes once we are at war in Vietnam, and that's why I think Senator Goldwater's trips to Vietnam later, your trips to Vietnam later, may leave you with a much different impression. But what I look at in the book is how and why these decisions were made that led to an American war in Vietnam. Now, once we are at war, then you can equate opposition to the war with unpatriotism, or not being patriotic, not supporting the troops, not supporting what has become a national cause. But what is striking
Your
about
point is that cause was never validated.
It was never validated and never debated, and that was deliberate on the part of the president. In July of 1965, the president's dishonesty reaches its peak. He tells Congress and tells the American public that he has only authorized half the number of troops he has in fact authorized for deployment to Vietnam. He tells them that not only is mobilization...
Is there a military excuse for that or not?
No, this is just to sell it to the American public.
Okay.
He tells them that that it will cost only the $1 billion that is already in the next fiscal year's defense appropriations, rather than the $13.2 billion he knows it's going to cost, because he knows that these initiatives and these decisions cannot survive a debate in Congress. He tells them that mobilization...
You can prove that that was a lie?
Oh, it's in the endnotes.
It's in the book.
Right.
In other words, he was given an estimate of $13 billion.
Right.
He tells the American people it costs $1 billion.
Right, and the Congress, most notably in his meetings with them, to sell them or to inform them of his decisions in July of 1965.
How many people were aware of that misrepresentation?
Certainly Robert McNamara,
Yeah.
certainly the Joint Chiefs of Staff,
and
members of their staffs who generated these estimates on what it would cost.
what should have been the action of individual Joint Chiefs? Resignation?
Well, no, I think what they should have done is told the truth, and they were given opportunities to do so.
Can you do that?
Before members, well, I think you have to. Actually, I think they would have found it quite liberating in retrospect if they had done so. These were men who retired with tremendous crises of conscience. They're asked directly by the Senate Armed Services Committee, House Armed Services Committee, how much will it cost? How many troops do we need? Do we need mobilization? And they obfuscate and do not answer those questions directly.
Thank you, Major McMaster, author of this remarkable book on Vietnam, Lyndon Johnson, Robert McNamara, the Joint Chiefs, and the lies that led to Vietnam. Thank you, ladies and gentlemen.
This program was a Warren Steibel production in association with South Carolina ETV. Funding for Firing Line was made possible by a major grant from the John M. Olin Foundation, Incorporated, and the Friends of Firing Line. For information about a video cassette of this program, write to Firing Line, 2700 Cypress Street, Columbia, South Carolina, 29205. Or call 803-799-3449. That's Firing Line, 2700 Cypress Street, Columbia, South Carolina, 29205. Or call 803-799-3449.